The pilot stopped in the aisle, looked directly at the black woman sitting in first class, then said the words that made the entire cabin turn. "Ma'am, this seat isn't for you." Silence. Complete silence. Interesting. Very interesting. Because the woman was holding a valid first-class boarding pass, and the pilot hadn't even looked at it. Around them, passengers exchanged glances. A businessman lowered his newspaper. A woman removed her headphones. Even a flight attendant near the galley froze. Nobody expected what was happening, especially not on a full flight, especially not in first class. The black woman looked up calmly. No anger, no surprise, just calm. The kind of calm that comes from experience. Years of experience. Her name was Naomi Bennett, 41 years old. Sharp, disciplined, successful, although nobody on that aircraft knew any of those things. Interesting. Very interesting. Because appearances often tell people what they expect to see, not what is actually there. Naomi wore a simple navy blazer. No luxury logos. No designer handbag. No expensive jewelry. Nothing that announced wealth. Nothing that announced power. Nothing that announced she was one of the most influential executives in the airline industry. That was intentional. Very intentional. She preferred it that way. 3 months earlier, the board of directors had selected her as the new CEO of Horizon Atlantic Airlines. The announcement wasn't public yet. Only senior leadership knew. The official introduction would happen next week. Until then, Naomi had a different plan. A personal plan. She wanted to experience the airline exactly the way passengers experienced it. No executive treatment. No private jet. No special escort. Just a ticket. A seat. And the truth. Interesting. Very interesting. Because the fastest way to learn about a company is to see how people behave when they don't know who's watching. Unfortunately, she was learning faster than expected. The pilot crossed his arms. Still waiting. Still staring. "Ma'am." Naomi smiled politely. "Is there a problem?" The question seemed reasonable. The pilot didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced around the cabin, almost as though looking for support. Then his eyes returned to her. "You're in the wrong seat." Several passengers looked uncomfortable because they had seen her board. They had seen the flight attendant scan her boarding pass. They had watched her sit down. Interesting. Very interesting. The pilot hadn't questioned anyone else. Only her. Naomi slowly reached into her purse, removed her boarding pass, then handed it to him. Without a word, the pilot glanced at it. Briefly. Very briefly. Then handed it back. Almost immediately. "I don't think that's yours." The words hung in the air. A few passengers frowned. One man quietly shook his head. Naomi's expression didn't change. Not even slightly. Inside, however, she was paying attention to every detail, every reaction, every decision. Interesting. Very interesting. Because moments like these reveal far more than policy manuals ever could. The pilot's name tag read, Victor Hayes. 23 years with the airline. Senior captain. Highly respected. At least on paper. Naomi memorized the name. Quietly. Carefully. Then she spoke. "It's assigned to me." Victor's jaw tightened. "No." A pause. "That seat belongs to first-class passengers." The sentence landed exactly the way he intended. Several people looked away. Embarrassed. Not for Naomi. For him. Interesting. Very interesting. Because everyone understood what he was implying. Even if nobody said it aloud. A young flight attendant named Claire stood near the front galley. Her face had gone pale. She knew the boarding records. She knew Naomi belonged there. She also knew Victor Hayes. And that knowledge made speaking up difficult. Very difficult. The captain turned toward Claire. "Can you verify this passenger?" Claire hesitated. Only briefly. But Naomi noticed. "Everything." The young woman swallowed hard. Her boarding pass scanned correctly. Victor looked annoyed. Not convinced. Annoyed. Interesting. Very interesting. Because sometimes people reject evidence when it conflicts with assumptions. Victor folded his arms again. "I'd like additional verification." The atmosphere changed. Passengers shifted in their seats. Whispers began. Phones appeared. One. Then another. Then several. Nobody was recording openly yet. But they were thinking about it. Naomi remained calm. Still calm. Almost impossibly calm. The pilot mistook that calmness for weakness. That would prove expensive. Very expensive. 5 minutes later, airport security stepped onto the aircraft. The moment they appeared, the cabin became completely silent. One officer approached. Professional. Polite. Ma'am. Naomi stood. Slowly. Gracefully. No argument. No scene. No raised voice. Interesting. Very interesting. Because everyone expected a confrontation. Instead, they witnessed dignity. The security officer looked uncomfortable. Embarrassed, even. But procedures were procedures. At least for now. Naomi picked up her bag. Then glanced briefly toward Claire. The young flight attendant looked devastated. Like someone watching a wrong decision happen in real time. Naomi offered her a small smile. A reassuring smile. Oddly enough, the woman being removed from first class looked more composed than anyone else on the plane. Victor seemed satisfied. Certain. Confident. The confidence of a man who believed he had solved a problem, not created one. Interesting. Very interesting. As Naomi stepped off the aircraft, she heard whispers behind her. Questions. Confusion. Doubt. Yet nobody knew the truth. Not yet. The terminal outside was quiet. Much quieter than the cabin she had just left. The security officers apologized. Repeatedly. Naomi thanked them, then walked toward a window overlooking the aircraft. Flight 728. Her flight. The flight now delayed because of a decision made by Captain Victor Hayes. She removed her phone, opened her contacts, selected a single number. The call connected almost instantly. Good afternoon, Ms. Bennett. No surprise. No confusion. Only respect. Naomi watched baggage crews moving below, then spoke calmly. The same calm she had maintained all afternoon. I need you to hold Flight 728 at the gate. Silence. Interesting. Very interesting. Because people at the highest levels of a company learn to recognize certain tones. And Naomi's tone meant something was wrong. Very wrong. The voice on the other end finally answered. Immediately. Without hesitation. Yes, Madam CEO. Inside the aircraft, Captain Victor Hayes was preparing for departure. Confident. Relaxed. Completely unaware that within the next 15 minutes, his entire career was about to change. Within the next 15 minutes, Captain Victor Hayes' entire career was about to change. The problem was, he didn't know it yet. Interesting. Very interesting. Because confidence can be dangerous when it's built on assumptions. Inside Flight 728, passengers remained seated. The aircraft should have been taxiing by now. It wasn't. The engines were ready. The cabin crew was ready. The passengers were definitely ready. Yet the aircraft remained parked at the gate. Motionless. The delay announcement arrived 3 minutes later. Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience. We are currently awaiting operational clearance. Whispers immediately spread through the cabin. People checked watches. Phones appeared. Frustration started building. Victor sat in the cockpit reviewing departure information. Annoyed. Not worried. Just annoyed. Interesting. Very interesting. Because he still believed the situation had ended the moment Naomi left the plane. As far as he was concerned, the problem had been removed. Meanwhile, 30 yards away, Naomi stood inside a private conference room overlooking the terminal. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Quiet lighting. Minimal furniture. The type of room reserved for senior executives. The security officers who escorted her off the plane had already left. Both looked embarrassed. Both had apologized repeatedly. Naomi held no anger toward them. They hadn't created the situation. They had simply responded to it. There was a difference. A very important difference. Interesting. Very interesting. The door opened. A man in his 50s entered immediately, followed by 2 others. All 3 wore executive badges. All 3 looked nervous. Extremely nervous. The first man extended his hand. Ms. Bennett. Naomi shook it. No smile. No hostility. Just professionalism. I came as quickly as I could. His name was Robert Sinclair, Chief Operating Officer. One of only a handful of people who knew she would become CEO next week. Robert sat across from her. The others remained standing. Nobody seemed comfortable. For good reason. Interesting. Very interesting. Because every executive in that room understood exactly what this incident could mean. Not publicly. Internally. If a future CEO could be treated that way, what was happening to ordinary passengers? Naomi placed her boarding pass on the table, then spoke. Calmly. Always calmly. Walk me through the chain of events. Robert immediately began taking notes. Every detail mattered. The boarding process. The seat assignment. The verification scan. The confrontation. The security removal. Everything. Nothing omitted. Nothing softened. Interesting. Very interesting. Because real leaders don't ask questions hoping for comfortable answers. They ask questions hoping for truthful ones. As Naomi spoke, Robert's expression gradually changed. Concern became discomfort. Discomfort became alarm. Alarm became something else entirely. Recognition. Because he had seen complaints before. Many complaints. Some similar. Too similar. The realization unsettled him. A lot. Back on the aircraft, Claire stood near the galley pretending to organize paperwork. In reality, she couldn't focus. Not even a little. The image kept replaying in her head. Naomi standing calmly. Victor refusing to listen. Security arriving. Everything. Interesting. Very interesting. Because Claire knew something most passengers didn't. Victor had done this before. Not exactly this. But close. Very close. Questions asked more aggressively to certain passengers. Extra scrutiny. Additional verification. Patterns. Always patterns. The young flight attendant hated it. Yet she had never reported it. Never formally. Fear has a way of silencing people. Especially junior employees. Victor exited the cockpit. Immediately noticing her expression. You look worried. Claire froze. Only briefly. I'm fine. The captain nodded. Not convinced. But uninterested. Operations says we're delayed another 10 minutes. Passengers overheard. Groans followed. Victor looked irritated. Again. Still not worried. Interesting. Very interesting. Because some storms arrive quietly. The most dangerous ones often do. Back in the conference room, Naomi listened as another executive entered. Then another. Then another. The room was filling. Fast. Very fast. Word had spread through senior management. Not publicly. Internally. The future CEO had just been removed from first class by one of their own pilots. Nobody wanted to be the last executive informed. Robert finally stopped writing. The notebook contained several pages now. He looked exhausted. Naomi noticed. Everything. Then she asked a simple question. One question. The question that changed the room. How many complaints have we received involving Captain Hayes? Silence. Complete silence. Interesting. Very interesting. Because nobody answered immediately. That alone was an answer. Robert looked toward another executive. The executive looked toward the floor. Finally someone spoke. There have been a few. A few. Naomi's voice remained calm. The calm somehow made it worse. The executive swallowed. Several. Another pause. Maybe more. The room grew quieter. Interesting. Very interesting. Because hidden problems often survive because nobody wants to count them. Naomi folded her hands. No anger. No outrage. No dramatic reaction. Just focus. Pull everything. The executives looked up. Everything. Everything. Customer complaints. HR reports. Flight attendant statements. Passenger feedback. Internal reviews. All of it. Nothing excluded. Nothing protected. The room immediately came alive. Phones appeared. Messages sent. Calls placed. Investigation started. Because when a CEO gives instructions, people move. Very quickly. Meanwhile, Flight 728 remained parked. The passengers had now waited nearly 30 minutes. Questions multiplied. Speculation exploded. One passenger posted online. Then another. Then another. The story started spreading. A black woman removed from first class despite holding a valid ticket. Interesting. Very interesting. Because technology turns local incidents into national conversations surprisingly fast. Victor finally received a call from operations. He answered casually, expecting routine information. Instead, the voice on the other end sounded unusually formal. Very formal. Captain Hayes. Yes. A pause. Long enough. We need you to remain at the gate. Victor frowned. We already are. Another pause. Then the sentence arrived. The sentence that made his stomach tighten for the first time all day. Senior corporate leadership is on site. Silence. Interesting. Very interesting. Because airlines do not dispatch senior leadership to gates over ordinary delays. Victor knew that. Everyone knew that. The captain's expression changed. Only slightly. But enough. What exactly is going on? The voice answered carefully. Too carefully. I'm not authorized to discuss that. Then the call ended. Victor stood motionless, looking through the cockpit window, toward the terminal, toward the gate, toward a future he suddenly couldn't predict. And for the first time since asking Naomi to leave first class, Captain Victor Hayes began to feel something unfamiliar. Concern. Real concern. For the first time since asking Naomi to leave first class, Captain Victor Hayes felt concerned. Real concern. The feeling only grew stronger 10 minutes later. Interesting. Very interesting. Because uncertainty becomes much heavier when nobody will answer your questions. Flight 728 remained parked at the gate. Passengers were becoming restless. Phones continued recording. Social media posts continued spreading. The delay had now exceeded 45 minutes. Nobody understood why. Not completely. Not yet. Inside the terminal conference room, Naomi Bennett reviewed the growing stack of reports. Customer complaints. Internal notes. Employee statements. Everything. The pile seemed to grow by the minute. Interesting. Very interesting. Because organizations often hide problems in separate departments. Until someone places all the pieces together. Then patterns emerge. Very clear patterns. Robert Sinclair stood near the window reviewing messages on his phone. Every few seconds another update arrived. Legal department. Human resources. Operations. Public relations. The entire company seemed awake now. Very awake. Finally Robert looked up. His expression had changed. Again. What is it? Naomi asked. The COO hesitated. Then answered carefully. We found 12 formal complaints. Silence. Interesting. Very interesting. Because 12 complaints aren't 12 incidents. They're usually far more. Most people never file reports. Most simply leave. The room remained quiet. Then Robert continued. 3 involved passengers questioning why they were singled out. A pause. 2 involved flight attendants. Another pause. And several were never fully investigated. Naomi said nothing. Not immediately. She simply listened. That made everyone more uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. Because calm leaders force people to sit with the truth. Back on the aircraft, Victor's patience was disappearing. Fast. Very fast. He exited the cockpit again. Walked toward the lead flight attendant station. Claire immediately noticed him approaching. Her stomach tightened. Victor looked irritated. No surprise there. Then he asked, Has anyone explained this delay? No, Captain. His jaw tightened. Unbelievable. Interesting. Very interesting. Because Victor still believed he was the victim of inconvenience. Not the cause of it. A few moments later, another call arrived. This time from airport operations. Victor answered immediately. Finally. No response. Only silence. Then a voice. Formal. Controlled. Captain Hayes. Yes. You are requested to remain available for immediate review. Victor frowned. What review? Another pause. Then, corporate review. The line went dead. Interesting. Very interesting. Because corporations use very specific language. And experienced employees know when words matter. Corporate review. Not operational review. Not scheduling review. Corporate review. That phrase sat heavily in Victor's mind. For the first time all afternoon, he started replaying events. The confrontation. The boarding pass. The security escort. The black woman. Something felt wrong. Not morally. Strategically. His instincts finally detected danger. Meanwhile, Naomi stood, walked toward the conference room window, and looked down at Flight 728. The aircraft remained exactly where she had left it. Interesting. Very interesting. Because in less than an hour she had learned more about her airline than months of reports could have taught her. The door opened again. A senior airport director entered, breathing slightly harder than normal, clearly moving quickly. Ms. Bennett. He nodded respectfully. We've prepared transportation if needed. Naomi shook her head. No. The director looked confused. I'd like to return to the aircraft. Silence. Complete silence. Several executives exchanged glances. Interesting. Very interesting. Because nobody expected that answer. Most executives would have left. Most would have handled everything remotely. Not Naomi. She wanted to see what happened next. With her own eyes. 20 minutes later, the gate area changed completely. Airport managers arrived. Operations supervisors appeared. Senior personnel gathered. Passengers inside the terminal noticed immediately. Something unusual was happening. Very unusual. Questions spread. Speculation exploded. Then came the moment nobody expected. The gate agent received a call. Listened. Then stood upright. Very upright. The type of posture people adopt when speaking with someone important. Extremely important. The agent hung up. Then looked toward the terminal entrance. Interesting. Very interesting. Because everyone else's eyes followed. A small group approached. Executives. Airport leadership. Corporate staff. And walking calmly in the center of them was Naomi Bennett. The same woman removed from first class. The same woman escorted off the plane. The same woman Victor believed had caused a minor inconvenience. Passengers immediately recognized her. Whispers erupted. That's her. She's back. What is happening? Phones appeared everywhere. Again. Inside the aircraft, Claire looked through the open boarding door. Then froze. Completely froze. Because she recognized the people surrounding Naomi. Senior leadership. Very senior leadership. People flight attendants almost never see in person. Interesting. Very interesting. The young flight attendant suddenly understood. Not everything, but enough. Something enormous was happening. Then she noticed how every executive behaved around Naomi. Respectfully, carefully, almost deferentially. Claire's eyes widened. The realization hit instantly. Hard. The woman wasn't connected to leadership. The woman was leadership. Meanwhile, Victor stood near the cockpit entrance watching the commotion outside. Confused. Concerned. Now genuinely concerned. The boarding door opened fully. The executives entered first. Then airport management. Then Naomi. Silence immediately filled the aircraft. Every passenger watched. Nobody looked away. Interesting. Very interesting. Because human beings instinctively recognize moments that matter. This was one of them. Naomi walked down the aisle. The same aisle she had walked earlier. Only now everything felt different. Very different. Nobody questioned her seat. Nobody challenged her ticket. Nobody spoke at all. Victor stared, trying to understand, trying to calculate, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Then Robert Sinclair stepped forward. The COO's voice carried clearly through the first-class cabin. Good afternoon, everyone. Passengers looked up, confused. Robert continued. There has been a delay because we needed to address a serious issue involving this flight. Silence. Interesting. Very interesting. Because suddenly every passenger realized their suspicions had been correct. Something had happened. Something significant. Robert then turned toward Naomi. The entire cabin followed his gaze. And with one sentence, everything changed. This is Naomi Bennett. A pause. Long enough. Our incoming chief executive officer. Complete silence. The kind of silence that feels physical. Victor's face lost color instantly. Passengers stared. Claire covered her mouth. One businessman nearly dropped his phone. Interesting. Very interesting. Because the most powerful moments require no exaggeration. Only truth. Naomi looked directly at Victor. Calm. Composed. Exactly as she had been from the beginning. Then she spoke. Not loudly. Not angrily. Just clearly. Captain Hayes. The pilot swallowed. For the first time all day, he had no words. Naomi held his gaze. Then delivered the sentence that froze the entire aircraft. Let's discuss who belongs on this plane. Let's discuss who belongs on this plane. The sentence hung in the cabin like turbulence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Interesting. Very interesting. Because 30 minutes earlier, Naomi Bennett had been escorted off the aircraft. Now the entire airline seemed to be standing behind her. Captain Victor Hayes stared at the woman he had removed from first class. The woman he had questioned. The woman he had publicly humiliated. And for the first time all day, he looked uncertain. Very uncertain. Robert Sinclair stepped forward. His voice remained professional. Controlled. Measured. Exactly the way executives speak when every word matters. Captain Hayes, please step into the jet bridge. Silence. Interesting. Very interesting. Because everyone understood what that really meant. The flight attendants understood. The passengers understood. Even Victor understood. This wasn't a discussion. It was a consequence. For several seconds, the veteran pilot remained frozen. Then he nodded. Slowly. The confidence that had carried him through the afternoon was gone. Completely gone. As Victor exited the aircraft, dozens of eyes followed him. No one applauded. No one celebrated. The moment felt too serious for that. Meanwhile, Naomi turned toward the passengers. Many expected anger. Many expected a speech. Many expected revenge. Instead, she apologized. I'm sorry for the delay. Silence. Interesting. Very interesting. Because the person who had been wronged was apologizing to everyone else. Several passengers exchanged glances. A woman near row 2 quietly shook her head. Another passenger murmured, "You don't owe us an apology." Naomi heard it, but simply smiled. The same calm smile. The same composed smile. The smile that had survived humiliation, scrutiny, and embarrassment. Then she turned toward Claire. The young flight attendant immediately straightened. Nervous. Very nervous. Interesting. Very interesting. Because Claire had spent the last hour wondering whether she should have spoken up sooner, wondering whether courage had arrived too late. Naomi looked at her. Not as a CEO, not as a superior, as a person. What was your name? Claire. The answer came softly. Naomi nodded. Thank you for telling the truth. The young flight attendant's eyes immediately became glossy, not because of praise, because of relief. For the first time all afternoon, someone had noticed. Someone had seen what happened. Someone had understood. Back inside the terminal, Victor sat alone in a conference room. The same kind of conference room Naomi had occupied earlier. Only the atmosphere felt very different. Interesting. Very interesting. Because rooms never create pressure. Truth does. Across the table sat representatives from human resources, operations, corporate compliance, and Robert Sinclair. A recorder sat in the center. The sight alone made Victor uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. The meeting began. Simple questions. Basic questions. Questions that should have been easy to answer. Why did you challenge the passenger? Why did you reject the boarding pass? Why was security called? Victor answered. At first. Then things became more difficult. Because evidence kept appearing. One document. Then another. Then another. Passenger statements. Witness accounts. Flight records. Interesting. Very interesting. Because facts have a habit of accumulating. Especially when nobody expects them to. The conversation shifted. What led you to believe Ms. Bennett wasn't authorized for first class? Victor hesitated. Only briefly. But everyone noticed. The hesitation mattered. A lot. I had concerns. What concerns? Another pause. Longer this time. No good answer arrived. Because the real answer couldn't be spoken aloud. And everyone in the room knew it. Interesting. Very interesting. The investigation widened rapidly. Faster than anyone expected. Human Resources reviewed previous complaints. Operations reviewed incident reports. Corporate Compliance reviewed customer feedback. Every department started digging. And what they found wasn't good. Not good at all. Patterns emerged. Clear patterns. Repeated patterns. Passengers questioned unnecessarily. Certain travelers receiving additional scrutiny. Flight attendants feeling pressured not to challenge decisions. Interesting. Very interesting. Because isolated incidents can be explained. Patterns cannot. Back on Flight 728, Naomi sat quietly in the first-class seat she had originally purchased. The exact same seat. The exact same location. The only difference was truth. Truth had changed everything. The aircraft remained at the gate while a replacement captain was located. Passengers understood why. Nobody complained. Not anymore. Several had begun reading online articles. Others watched videos. The story was spreading quickly. Very quickly. Meanwhile, Claire sat near the galley reviewing paperwork she wasn't actually reading. Her mind remained elsewhere. Specifically, on one question. Should she finally tell the truth? All of it. Interesting. Very interesting. Fear had protected silence for years. But today something felt different. A message arrived on her company tablet. Corporate interview requested. Immediately, Claire stared at the screen, then looked toward Naomi, then back toward the screen. Her hands trembled slightly. Not from fear. From decision. Several hours later, she sat across from investigators. The first few questions were simple. Routine. Then came the important one. Have you observed similar behavior before? Silence. Long silence. Interesting. Very interesting. Because everyone reaches a moment where remaining silent becomes harder than speaking. Claire lowered her eyes. Then finally answered. Yes. The single word changed everything. More questions followed. More answers followed. Stories emerged. Events. Complaints. Conversations. Things employees had whispered about for years. Things nobody believed would ever matter. Now they mattered. A lot. Later that evening, Naomi reviewed the findings personally. Page after page. Statement after statement. And with every page, one realization became clearer. The problem wasn't only Victor Hayes. The problem was the culture that allowed people to look away. Interesting. Very interesting. Because one person can make a bad decision, but a culture teaches people to tolerate it. That realization bothered Naomi more than anything else. By midnight, preliminary conclusions had already been reached. Captain Victor Hayes was removed from active flight status pending investigation. Additional reviews were authorized. Employee interviews expanded. Policies were being examined. The company was changing. Fast. Very fast. The next morning, Naomi stood alone inside her office overlooking the city. Sunlight reflected off distant buildings. Aircraft moved across the horizon. For a moment, she simply watched them, thinking, reflecting, processing. Then Robert entered carrying another folder. A thick one. The COO looked exhausted, but hopeful. Interesting. Very interesting. Because sometimes organizations improve only after being forced to confront uncomfortable truths. Robert placed the folder on her desk. We found more. Naomi nodded. She wasn't surprised. Not anymore. Then she asked a question. The question that would determine everything moving forward. How many employees wanted to speak up? A pause. But believed nobody would protect them. Robert looked down at the folder, then answered quietly. More than we thought. Silence. Naomi stared out the window again. The city moved below. Aircraft departed. Passengers traveled. Life continued. But inside Horizon Atlantic Airlines, something fundamental had begun to change. And before the investigation was over, the entire company would be forced to decide what kind of airline it wanted to become. Before the investigation was over, Horizon Atlantic Airlines had a decision to make. A very important decision. Interesting. Very interesting. Because every company eventually becomes what it chooses to tolerate. For years, certain complaints had been ignored. Certain warnings had been minimized. Certain employees had remained silent. Not because they didn't care, because they didn't believe anyone would listen. Now someone was listening, and everything was changing. Fast. Very fast. 3 weeks after Flight 728, the investigation concluded. The findings filled hundreds of pages. Witness statements, passenger reports, internal communications, employee interviews. Everything. Nothing hidden. Nothing protected. Interesting. Very interesting. Because truth tends to grow larger once people stop being afraid of it. The final report reached Naomi's desk early on a Monday morning. She read every page, every word, every statement. Several times she stopped reading. Not because she was surprised, because she was disappointed. The patterns were impossible to ignore. The evidence was impossible to dismiss. The conclusions were impossible to avoid. Captain Victor Hayes would not return to active service. His employment with Horizon Atlantic ended shortly afterward. Quietly, professionally, without public drama. Interesting. Very interesting. Because Naomi wasn't interested in humiliation. She was interested in accountability. There was a difference. A very important difference. The pilot who once believed he could decide who belonged in first class was gone. But Naomi knew removing one person wasn't enough. Not even close. Because the real problem had never been one pilot. The real problem was a culture that allowed good people to remain silent. A culture where employees feared speaking up. A culture where complaints disappeared into filing cabinets. A culture where assumptions sometimes mattered more than facts. That culture had to change. Completely. Several weeks later, Naomi stood before hundreds of Horizon Atlantic employees. Pilots, flight attendants, managers, executives, ground crews, every department, every level. The company auditorium was packed. Interesting. Very interesting. Because everyone knew this meeting wasn't about a pilot. It was about the future. Naomi walked to the podium. No prepared speech in her hand. No dramatic presentation. Just honesty. The room became silent. Then she spoke. The issue wasn't what happened to me. A pause. It was what happened before me. The employees listened carefully. Very carefully. Because everyone understood what she meant. There had been others. Many others. People whose names never reached executives. People whose complaints never became headlines. People who simply walked away. Naomi continued. We cannot build an airline where dignity depends on who's watching. Silence. Complete silence. Interesting. Very interesting. Because nobody could argue with that. The room remained still. Then Naomi announced a series of changes. Independent complaint review systems. Mandatory bias and leadership training. Anonymous employee reporting protections. New passenger advocacy procedures. Executive ride-along audits. Direct reporting channels to senior leadership. The reforms were extensive. Very extensive. Some employees looked surprised. Others looked relieved. Especially those who had spent years hoping someone would finally listen. Meanwhile, Claire sat near the middle of the auditorium. Listening. Processing. Trying not to become emotional. Interesting. Very interesting. Because a few weeks earlier she had nearly remained silent. Now her testimony had helped reshape an entire company. After the meeting ended, employees slowly filed out. Many stopped to speak with Naomi. Some offered support. Others offered ideas. Several simply said thank you. Then Claire approached, nervously, the same way she had approached passengers during her first week on the job. Naomi immediately recognized her and smiled. The young flight attendant relaxed instantly. Ms. Bennett. Claire. The flight attendant laughed softly. You remembered. Naomi nodded. Of course. A brief silence followed. Then Claire spoke. I almost didn't say anything. Interesting. Very interesting. Because courage often looks different in hindsight. Naomi understood exactly what she meant. The CEO smiled gently. But you did. The young woman's eyes filled with tears. Not dramatic tears. Not sad tears. Relieved tears. The kind that arrive when someone finally feels safe. Months passed. Then more months. The story gradually disappeared from the news cycle, as stories always do. But inside Horizon Atlantic, the effects remained. Employee reporting increased. Customer satisfaction improved. Workplace complaints were addressed faster. Trust slowly returned. Not overnight. Real change never happens overnight. But it happened. And that mattered. A lot. Interesting. Very interesting. Because culture isn't changed through announcements. It's changed through daily decisions. One afternoon, nearly a year after Flight 728, Naomi boarded another Horizon Atlantic aircraft. No executive escort. No publicity. Just a ticket. A seat. An observation. Some habits never change. She entered first class quietly. Almost unnoticed. Almost. Near the boarding door stood a familiar face. Claire. Only now her uniform was different. Her badge was different. Her confidence was different. She had been promoted. Lead flight attendant. Naomi smiled. Claire smiled back. Both remembered. Neither needed to say why. Passengers continued boarding. Families. Business travelers. Retirees. Students. People from every background imaginable. Then an elderly woman approached first class. Looking uncertain. Very uncertain. She checked her boarding pass twice. Then 3 times. Clearly nervous. Clearly uncomfortable. Interesting. Very interesting. Because everyone knows what it feels like not to belong. At least once. The woman looked toward Claire. I'm sorry. Her voice was hesitant. I think this is my seat, but I've never flown first class before. Claire looked at the boarding pass. Then smiled warmly. A genuine smile. The kind people remember. You're exactly where you're supposed to be, ma'am. Silence. A small silence. But an important one. The older woman smiled back. Relieved. Comfortable. Welcome. Naomi watched the interaction from her seat. And smiled. Not because she had won. Not because someone else had lost. Because something had changed. Something real. Something lasting. Outside the window, the sun was beginning to set. Golden light reflected across the wing. The aircraft slowly pushed back from the gate. Passengers settled into their seats. The cabin felt calm. Peaceful. Different. Interesting. Very interesting. Because 1 year earlier, a pilot had looked at a black woman and decided she didn't belong. Now an entire company had learned a better lesson. Dignity isn't earned through status. Respect isn't reserved for the powerful. And belonging isn't determined by assumptions. As the aircraft climbed into the evening sky, Naomi looked out the window. The clouds glowed gold beneath the setting sun. Then she closed her eyes, finally satisfied. Because the goal had never been revenge. The goal had always been improvement. And sometimes, the most powerful leaders aren't the ones who prove they belong. They're the ones who make sure everyone else does too.